Many of us feel the need to stay informed, and I'm sure for a lot of us, it's because we believe it can help our portfolios. What if I told you that I could give you next week's headlines? Could you profit from it? So after that lead in, I'm actually going to start in a slightly different place. My understanding, I didn't get to see the game, is that a Mitrovic scored in the World Cup today, which is very exciting. As you can imagine, there aren't too many times where I get to see a namesake score on the world stage. To my knowledge, no Mitrovic NBA or NFL players probably have ever existed. Did my best and failed on both fronts. Unfortunately, it was in a loss, but nonetheless, a moment of glory for us Mitroviches here today. Well, to the point of my lead in, what if I told you we could get access to major world event headlines for next week? Could we be better investors? Would that help our portfolios? I believe most people think that it would. And whether they're in advance or even in today's terms, I believe that because again, when I get calls, questions, whether they're clients, friends, people I meet, they're never about rates of change of growth or underlying economic data, and for good reason. One, people have better things to do with their time, and then two, to the extent that they're working for us, they're trusting that we're watching those things. What they do ask about is, what do you think about Trump? What do you think about tariffs? What do you think about inflation? What do you think about the upcoming election? Whatever happens to be in the news cycle for that time. We've talked about this a number of times, including in February 5th in a special update we put out when markets were so turbulent around really looking past headlines. We've got a link to that. Feel free to go back and look at that. I did so again today, and I think there's still some timely information in there for people. We also put out a video on March 16th called Overcoming Oneself, where we really talked about just our natural impulses as investors, the emotions of it, the need to try to find certainty and explanation that I think you would find helpful. And again, we have a link for that. Got to give credit to a gentleman named Avi Gilbert, put out a great article. I want to make sure I get this headline right, called Here's Next Week's News in Advance. How will you trade it? That was a little bit different spin, and really the impetus behind this week's video. There'll be a link to that below as well. But his whole point was, what if we knew major macro events a week in advance, particularly those of the geopolitical nature? Would we be able to make money from it? Is it helpful? And this article, I won't go through all the examples, but I encourage you to go through and take a look at it for those of you who are interested. But the general summary was no, it actually wouldn't be helpful. He talks about last November 28th, and he's like, what if a week ahead of time, I could have told you with certainty that North Korea was going to fire a missile at Japan, a major U.S. ally, one that caused the Japanese government to put out a warning telling all of their people to find shelter. Would you have shorted the market, or would have you bought stocks in advance of that event? And I think it's fair to say that most of us would have said, well, if I've got to pick one or the other, I'm going to get out or short the market. And in fact, the market went up 60 basis points. He looked at the Trump election. Obviously, a lot of people in advance of that said, hey, if Trump's elected, that's going to be a type of uncertainty given just, who Trump is, that the markets aren't going to like, and whether long-term or not, it's certainly going to sell off in the short run. You might remember as the election was going on and that election result started to come into a focus, the pre-markets were selling off strongly, only to turn around and finish the day up, and of course, ended up having a pretty strong few months, arguably even a strong 18 months. Whether that does or doesn't correlate to Trump is not the point of this. The point is that news headline would have done nothing to help you be able to anticipate markets. He quotes a couple different studies, one from 1998, pretty well known, again, within that site, where people went back, a team of scholars went back and looked in retrospect, not even in foresight, but in retrospect, at markets and said, hey, looking at these headlines, can we find the catalyst? Can we put the pieces together to explain things after the fact? And an amazing thing came out of that study. What they deduced, trying to quantify it, was that only about 1/5 of market movements could be explained by major macro events. Really, really interesting. And in fact, when they looked back over this time frame, they found that many of the major intraday movements of the stock market being, again, way up, way down for a given day, didn't correspond with any major news on that day's events. For another scholar, Dr. Hernan of the World Bank and IMF, said beyond the geopolitical, what if I even looked at macro fundamental economic data? What can I deduce from all of that? And what he found out, again, was that oftentimes things are good until they go bad, and they're bad until they go good. Point being, again, this truth that I think we all can speak, but on some level, we maybe don't believe about the ability to time markets using what commonly makes headlines, at least. They're not useful. So in conclusion, what do we make of all this? Well, one of the big things is I certainly understand the human need to explain things, but what these studies, what these examples show us is that there are a lot of things, perhaps even most things, that just are inexplicable. And they're certainly not helpful in terms of being able to make portfolio decisions, whether in advance or even in hindsight. Permit yourself to step back from applying that pressure to yourself and rather put it into planning. Again, with 20 years of experience working with clients, and of course by a byproduct of the day job, having lots of different conversations with other people and friends about their situations, here's something I just know and believe to be true, which is the people who have the greatest peace of mind, those people who are able to persevere through difficult times, are those people who have taken that time, that angst, that worry, and effort, and far from focusing on headlines and the coulda, woulda, shouldas, have put that into their story, where they want to go and how they're going to get there. And while we can't predict these markets, one of the things and one of the great gifts we can give clients is showing them, generally speaking, how in these different types of market conditions, what they could expect from their portfolio. And while we can't predict it and we can't change it, we can have a pretty good idea of it. And that knowledge and removing at least some level of the unknowns gives people a lot of comfort, and a comfort that can, again, help them maintain their patience and a discipline to get from where they are to where they want to go. So with that, we look forward to welcoming Kate Green next week to our event in Seattle, the winner of our first 10 Capital experience. Thank you so much for joining us. Check out the links below. They've got a lot of great information, and we'll see you next week.